I stumbled across this years ago, and even though it's kind of corny, I really liked it. I've kind of held on to it ever since then. Somebody wrote, "You may be a blot or a blessing, but nobody is a blank." Will you let that just kind of sink in for a minute? That is a sobering thought, isn't it? I think we would like to believe otherwise. I think we'd like to create another category there, but there isn't. There are really two options. In life, I'll be a blessing or a blot, but nobody is a blank. And so I want to take that idea and plug it into a specific setting and say this. Within our church family, nobody is a blank. So you know what the other two options are, right? One possibility is that I will be a blessing by my positive spirit and my encouraging work and by the efforts I make to contribute to what we're doing together. I can help pull the family together, and in whatever way I'm able to move us forward a little bit in the great mission we've undertaken to do together, I can help that along. I think that's good news, isn't it? You may be sitting there and saying, listen, I'm old, and I can't do what I used to be able to do. You can still be a blessing. Everybody can be. Doesn't matter what talents you bring to the table, whether you're not out of high school yet or you can't even remember when you went to high school, whether you bring certain skill set or don't think you have that many skills, it doesn't really matter. If you've been a Christian for the last 15 minutes or you can't remember how long you've been a Christian, you have the capacity in some way to positively impact the things we do together as a church family. Isn't that a great thought? And we ought to just leave it right there, right? But if we did, we wouldn't tell the whole story, because just saying that opens the door on this terrible possibility that because of my negative spirit or because of my discouraging behavior or maybe just because of my apathy, I just don't do anything at all. Maybe because of that, I'm actually holding us back or becoming a barrier to us reaching our potential. So you can do that too, because nobody is a blank. I want you to think with me about that, because I think tucked into that reality is the key to a church thriving. I want you to get this with me. Brothers and sisters, churches thrive where more and more of the people who are the church find their niche in God's kingdom. Figure it out what it is that God has enabled with his gifts, what has enabled them to do, and plug in and begin doing that work. And the more and more that happens, you see a church begin to thrive. That's why churches are successful in doing what God wants them to do. More and more of the people who are the church get busy doing their thing for the kingdom of God. But it works in reverse too, and I need you to see that, because the other side of that is that the more of us who unplug from the work and don't do the part that God has enabled us to do, then more the church begins to flounder and decline, and then eventually it dies. So I want you to think with me about that statement this morning, but think about it in a very, very personal way. You know where I'm going, right? So what am I? Am I a blot or a blessing? Look back on 2019, since we're right on the threshold of wrapping up this year. Over the course of this last year, what have you been? Be honest with yourself. We won't ask you to stand up and testify. Or look forward into 2020, which is right there. What are you going to be in the coming year? So I want to work on that a little bit this morning. I want us to think about how we can make a positive difference. And to help us with that, I want to head over into the New Testament to the letters of Paul. I think you can go first to Philippians. I think that's where I'm going to start here in a minute. But I especially want to look toward the end of Paul's letters, because often as he's wrapping up, he talks to these disciples about how he wants them to make a difference. And he does that by identifying specific things that he wants them to do. And so I want us to notice some of those this morning as we try to quantify what it is we might do to make a positive difference. I've got about 4 or 5 things I want you to consider with me this morning. If you have a copy of the update, you can pull that out, and on the back side, there's some places to write these things down so that you can carry them with you this morning and remember them. I'm going to begin right here in this place. If we want to make a positive difference, and this is going to be kind of fundamental, this will be sort of the ABCs of the lesson, okay? First thing we got to do is we got to do something, okay? In fact, that'll be the umbrella that hangs over everything else we're going to talk about. We'll first say we have to do something, and then we'll talk about some of the things we can do. But let's just begin right there. We have to do something. For a decade, my boys played Little League baseball. And Heidi and I were heavily involved in that, coach and team mom, and worked with the league. And sometimes we were just spectators. We went and watched the game. But there's one game that particularly sticks out in my mind. I don't remember a lot of that, but just a few of those particularly impressive moments. There was a lady, a mom, who had a son on the team we were playing, so they were the enemy that day. I thought that was funnier than y'all did, evidently. And this woman griped from the very start of the game about everything that the umpire did. Any call, no matter how legit it was, any call that went against her team, she started making noise, and she rode that umpire inning after inning after. I mean, there was hardly a play that she didn't have something loud to say about it. And that just went on and on for the whole game. And I was thinking, I think it was down to about the last inning. One of their boys was up to bat. He got called out on a strike. And man, she went off again. And that umpire had reached his limit. And he threw up his hands and he called time. And he turned around and he walked over to the stands where the fans were sitting, and he stared right up at that mom. Yeah, I know, the thunder fits perfectly there. And everyone got really quiet. And he held up his chest protector with his left hand and the clicker he used to keep the count with his right hand. And he said, "Lady, would you like to have my job?" And he didn't say anything after that. He just stood there and stared at her. I mean, it felt like a month went by waiting for something to happen. And nobody said anything. And for the first time all day, she was quiet. And after a while, he went back and took his position, and we finished the game. 2 groups take part in Little League baseball games. There are the participants, right? That's players mainly, and coaches and umpires who are actually involved in the game. But that's not the only people of the game, right? The other group at the game are spectators. Moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas and siblings that get drug along because parents can't leave them home alone. And they're the people who sit and watch the game. You have 2 groups at Little League games, participants and spectators. And as long as everybody behaves themselves, that's how Little League games are supposed to be. Are you with me on that? You see that? Little League games are supposed to have spectators and participants, not churches. You see where we're going with that? Brothers and sisters, churches have no spectators. None of us get the job of just sitting back and watching, but instead, everyone is supposed to be a participant. There is something that God wants all of us to do. And so that's why we get to the end of these letters and we find Paul over and over again urging people to do something. So I said Philippians, back up just a little bit, Galatians 6. Look at verse 10, Galatians 6:10. When he says, while we have opportunity, what? Let us do good. And then in Titus chapter 3 and verse 14, as he's wrapping up that letter, our people, he said, must learn to devote themselves to doing what is good in order that they may provide for urgent needs, and he adds, and not live unproductive lives. Every one of us has something to do. Peter says we've all been given a gift and we're supposed to employ it. in doing the work of God. It is one of those keys, I think, that causes a church to thrive. More and more people finding their place and participating. But do you know what will kill a church? When it stops looking like a church and it stops looking like a Little League baseball game, where you got some people who are plugged in and involved and working really hard, and some people who just sit in the stands on Sunday and watch. In fact, worse than that, sometimes the people who are sitting in the stands act like that mom. And not only do they just sit there and watch, but they also start criticizing the participants. Have you seen that too? And y'all know how that works out ultimately? When you're working really hard and someone who's doing nothing just starts taking shots at you, eventually what happens is the participants begin to say, I don't need this grief. And what do? They take a seat in the stands. Some umpires do that too. They say, I'm not going to umpire these games anymore. I'm going to sit down and watch. And that's what some participants do. And I will tell you, as you take from the crowd of participants and you add to the crowd in the stands, do you see what happens? Churches begin to die. So listen, it needs to be working one way or the other. Either we need to be growing the pool of workers and thriving, or that pool is going to shrink and we begin to die. But brothers and sisters, that's where the line is drawn between churches that thrive and churches that die. And so what I'd like you to think about as we look ahead to 2020, and make this very personal. Where am I? If I'm going to make a difference, a positive difference in this church, I'm going to have to do something. I got to get out of the stands and get onto the field. I need to be a participant. Someone says, that's great, but what can I do? I'm glad you asked, because that's the rest of the sermon. This is gonna put arms and legs on the first point, okay? What is it that I can do to do something? Let me add this. You can give praise to other people. How about that? And if you're a student of Paul's letters, you know why I'm saying that, right? Because Paul was highly skilled at praising and commending other people. In fact, as you read his letters, you just find sprinkled throughout them, there are all these times where he pauses to say something good about some worker or some disciple and what they're doing for the Lord. Sometimes he doesn't even say it to them, like in Philippians. Look at Philippians 2 and verse 22. Paul is writing to Philippi, but he's talking about Timothy. And he talks about how Timothy had proved his work there in verse 22 and how he had helped in the spread of the gospel. Do you see that? He's just bragging on this good worker and praising him for his good efforts. And that's not the only time. We get on down into verse 30 of that same text. So this is Philippians 2 and verse 30. And he talks about Epaphroditus, a worker so dedicated to the cause that he almost died working for the cause. In fact, what's amazing to me is if you look in Philippians chapter 4, and we'll come back to this in a minute, he's got to talk about a couple of women in verse 2 who were fussing each other and creating disharmony in the church. But even when he's fussing at these two quarreling ladies, he compliments them in verse 3. He says, indeed, true companion, I ask you to help these women who have shared my struggle in the cause of the gospel. Isn't that remarkable? Even when he's got to kind of fuss at someone who isn't doing the right thing, he says, but here's a good thing they are doing. I could go on and on with examples of that, of Paul praising and commending other people. But here's the thing I want you to know about that. Doing that helps accomplish another thing that Paul urges us to do in his letters, and that is to be a source of encouragement to other people. So turn over to 1 Thessalonians 5. Turn to 1 Thessalonians 5, look down at verse 11. 1 Thessalonians 5:11, he says, therefore, encourage one another and build up one another just as you also are doing. The Thessalonians were already doing a good job of that, but it was so important, Paul said, I need to say it again. Y'all need to encourage each other. Now, I want to connect that with praise because I think praise is just one of the best ways to pull that off, isn't it? Think about yourself. How do you feel when someone comes up to you and said, oh, man, that was a great class you taught this morning. You showed me something in that text that I have never appreciated before. Or you spoke to some area of struggle in my life and that just meant so much to me. Thank you for that great class today. How does that make you feel? Or when someone grabs you after services and says, I read that card that you sent to my wife and I after my father died. And I got to tell you, it just warmed our hearts. We carried that with us all week long. That was such an encouragement to us. How does that make you feel? And doesn't it make you want to go out and do whatever it is that they commended you for, to go out and do that again? It inspires us and others to do something. So, let me ask you a really tough question. Have you ever paid attention to what comes out of your mouth? Do you tend to see good things going on and say something about that? Or are you an expert at finding every little thing that isn't the way I would like? Can you be honest with yourself about that? Because I'll be honest with myself about that. A friend of mine was preaching one time. He's preaching this lesson on marriage and talking about the problem of criticism in marriage. And as part of this lesson, he challenged those of us who were his audience to take a 24-hour criticism fast. What that meant is for 24 hours, you couldn't say anything negative or critical to your spouse. And if at any point in the 24 hours you messed up, you had to start over again. You had to go a whole 24 hours with saying nothing critical. Now, I told y'all before, I married very, very well, or caught hiding on a weekday, one way or the other. But there's just not much negative to say to my wife, about my wife. And so when he said that, I'm sitting there thinking, Wesley, this is going to be easy, man. Because there's just nothing critical to say to my wife. But remember, if you mess up any time in the 24 hours, you have to start over. And so you become very, very mouth. And discovered how often those comments were negative and critical. It was stunning. I had no idea. And so I wonder sometimes if we just get caught up in that habit of whining and griping about every little thing that goes on we don't like, that we don't realize it's all that ever coming out of our mouth is whining and griping, and we don't ever praise people, and we're never a source of encouragement to others. We just gripe all the time. And what we don't realize is how discouraging that is to people. And you've been on the end of that, haven't you? Someone comes along, worked really hard, teach a really great class, and they find some little nitpicky thing to gripe about. How do you feel after that? Driving home in the car, you say to yourself, why do I even do this? Griping and complaining is debilitating, tears people down. Tears churches down. So I think we need to think about that. And how much we are or we're not like Paul in this business of giving praise to people. I tell you what I love about that. Anybody can do it. If you're 7 years old or 77 years old, if you're young and healthy and active or bedridden, if you've been a disciple 10 minutes or a lot more than that, you could get busy finding good stuff and making sure you say something about that. And brothers and sisters, if we would get in that business, become a church full of people who are always looking for the good things to commend people about, what a difference that would make. Maybe that's something that I can do as I look into the coming year. And then there's this. Let me add this to the list. A third thing I can do is I can make peace. Now, let's head over to Philippians 4, and let's talk a little bit more about these two women we mentioned earlier who were at war with each other. So this is Philippians 4, and I'm looking down at verse 2. Look at verses 2 and 3. I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to live in harmony in the Lord. Indeed, true companion, I ask you also to help these women who have shared my struggle in the cause of the gospel, together with Clement also and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Now, I will confess that when I read this, I just have so many questions that aren't answered. Who are these two ladies? I don't know that we know anything else about them except this. How tragic. And I wonder what they're fussing about, don't you? What is the problem? And what is it about the problem that is so serious that Paul needs to write about it and call them by name? And why haven't they been able to get this worked out? Why is it necessary that he calls upon the church in verse 3, I think, to intervene as one and to help these two workers figure this out? Don't put any questions about this in the question box, because I'm telling you, I don't know. But I tell you what I know. These are two good sisters. Paul says that about them in verse 3. And yet they've had some kind of a dispute with each other that they haven't been able to get worked out. And it was such a serious problem, my guess is, having such an impact on the congregation, that Paul says to that church family, we need you guys to rise up as one. And we need you to help them fix this problem. That is what I know from these two verses. And there's some takeaways, I think, for me and you. Number one, this is going to happen. How many times have we said that? It bears repeating over and over again. This is going to happen. It happens in every church family. Frankly, it happens in your family too. So we shouldn't be surprised about that, right? You can't get 12 people together for Christmas without drama at your house, right? I know. It's just that way. And so how many people are here this morning? 350? And we're not going to have some drama along the way? Come on, what were you expecting? Heaven? That's to come, not here. Here's real life. And we're very different people with different backgrounds, and we have friction as we try to come together and do the work of God. But the other thing we need to carry away from this text is this. Those fusses have the potential of doing great harm. In fact, in an atmosphere of fussing and fighting, churches just can't thrive. All the energy and time is spent fixing fusses and not doing the work of God. Give you an illustration of that. This goes back many years ago. I got a call one Monday from a friend of mine that's an elder in another place, and he told me about his Sunday night. He said as soon as the service was over, one of the other elders grabbed him and took him back to a conference room where they met with two sisters who had a long-standing, bitter battle going with each other. Now, this was on Sunday night, and they met at the right time, 6 o'clock. Have I whined about that enough? And so you're thinking the sermon's over about 7, right? And he told me that from the time immediately after the service was over until after midnight, do the math, they sat in that conference room dealing with the bitter grudge between these two warring sisters. Now, let me tell you what didn't happen that night. That elder didn't get to visit with any of the guests who were with him that night. Maybe some searching soul had come that evening, and they didn't get to have any of the sheep over to their place to strengthen and encourage them. Frankly, they couldn't go out to dinner with any of their friends in their congregation and be uplifted and encouraged by them, because they had to go back to that conference room and spend 5 hours working on this bitter, ugly grudge. And I just want to tell you something, folks. The more a church fills up with that kind of thing, the less it is able to thrive. And eventually, it will die. So here's what I want to ask you to do. 2 things. Number 1, next time something makes you mad, pause. Don't say anything. Don't react. Don't go talk to anybody. Don't start texting. And don't get on Facebook. Pause. Sleep on it. When you get up the next morning, ask yourself, this thing that I'm upset about, is it really worth discouraging other people and spending time and energy, taking it away from the work we need to be doing for the Lord to manage this petty grudge? Is it worth it? And my guess is that most of the time when you sleep on it and you ask the tough questions, most of the time the answer is going to be no. But secondly, if it is a problem, be a peacemaker. Don't go gossip about it. In fact, don't participate in the gossip about it. Let's play the role that Paul wants the Philippian church to play in verse number 3. He says, you guys come together as one with these two sisters, and you help get it worked out. So if somebody texts you some gossip about someone else in the congregation they're having a problem with, text it back and say, I just called them and set up a meeting between the 3 of us. Let me tell you, you won't get any more texts like that, right? I've just set up a meeting between the 3 of us. We're going to get this worked out, because what we know is that disharmony tears us down. And in 2020, we're all about building us up. And so while we're talking about that, let me add this third thing to our list. Third thing we can do, and that is we got to keep pressing on. That's another thing I would add. That's something we can do. We can be in the business of pressing on. Why do I say that? I say that in part because of my first year experience as a very young preacher when I was preaching in Joliet, Illinois. I have to tell you, folks, that first year is etched in my memory forever, and not for good reason. The first week we were at Joliet, people started dying. Lots of them. The very first death was a young 30-year-old man who had died of AIDS. That's the first funeral I ever had to preach. And then there were more to come. We'd been in Joliet 3 weeks when the heavens dropped a F5 tornado that tore right through the middle of our town, killed dozens of people, destroyed the home of one of our families. Their 4 kids were home alone and in the only part of the house that still had a roof when it was over. Thankful for God's providence there. We'd been there 3 months when on a Wednesday night, one of the guys jumped up as we were trying to close the service, stood up in the pulpit, announced to the congregation, "This church is in sin and my wife and I just can't handle it anymore and we're leaving." Well, that was a moment. Only better because one of the elders followed him and said, "Well, you've made the charge, but you haven't told us what the sin is. So why don't you get back up and tell us what the sin is?" And he did, and the elder followed and answered him, and for 45 minutes, the rest of us sat there terrified. By the time the first year was over, we hadn't baptized anybody. And Heidi and I began to wonder, do you think maybe we can go back to Texas? We were discouraged. But the disciples who made up that church family, they were discouraged. They were sick of it. And they were ready for something different. And to their credit, in spite of all those setbacks and the trouble, those people just dug in and lifted up our hands and kept doing the right things. And by the time we reached the end of our second year, we had baptized 24 people, and the church had grown by 25%. Please don't hear me taking any credit for that. Remember, we were discouraged and ready to go back to Texas. Those faithful disciples pressed on through the difficulties and did great things for God. And so with that thought in our minds, I want you to listen to this at the end of Galatians. This is Galatians chapter 6. And see if this doesn't fit exactly into that scenario, where Paul says, "Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary." Let me tell you, when we're going through tough times, here's what the devil wants to say. Things are never going to get better. This mountain you're trying to climb, there's not another side. This corner you're trying to turn, you're not ever going to turn the corner. It's always going to be bad. Things are never going to change. That's what the devil wants you to believe. And what I learned from my first year in Chicago is that very often what happens is great victory is just over that next hill we have to get past. And so what's the lesson to take away? What did Paul say to us? In Galatians 6, in verse 9, he says, "Do not lose heart. Keep doing good." What did we say? We said, press on. Why? Because we will reap if we don't grow weary. I need to be one of those disciples who keeps pressing on. And then the last thing I want to add to my list is just the word prayer. We need to be a church that is a praying church. Why do I say that? Because of all the admonitions you will find at the end of Paul's letter, I would suggest to you that this is the one you find far more frequently than any other. In fact, at the end of virtually every letter, at some point, he's going to say to the disciples what he said to the Ephesians in Ephesians 6 in verse 18. "I need you to pray, and I need you to pray for me." What did he tell the Philippians in Philippians 4 and verse 6? "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." In fact, in Colossians 4 and verse 2, he told the Colossians to be devoted to prayer. And he adds, "Pray for me too." And then in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 17, he says, what? Pray without ceasing. And then in 2 Thessalonians 3:1, he wraps up that letter by asking them to join him in prayer for his work. Over and over and over again. Paul is urging them to do that. I think that becomes trite to us. Obviously, we need to talk about prayer. I don't know that we embrace and believe in the power of prayer like we used to. I'll tell you two reasons I put this on the list. Number one, I put it on the list because everybody can do it. I mean, if you're breathing and you have a relationship with Jesus, you can do this for our church. But secondly, it makes a difference. Sometimes when we got some hurdle in front of us and we don't know how we're going to get beyond it, how we're going to deal with this problem, let me tell you something. He does. And I love the thoughts of Paul backing up in Ephesians a little bit to chapter 4 and verse 20. I hang on to this verse all the time, Ephesians 4:20, where we're reminded, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we can think or ask. Just Paul is right there. What is he saying to us? Listen, God is able to do what we don't even know or understand. We don't have a problem that's too big for him to handle. He said, when we get to that place where we just don't know what to do, we can always pray because he knows what to do. I want to bless this church this year. Pray for us. Pray for us all the time. Because everybody has an impact. I may be a blot, I may be a blessing, but nobody is going to be a blank. So I wonder, as you look into 2020, what are you going to be? What will your impact be? Maybe listening to this, you've thought to yourself, you know what? I'm one of those people sitting in the stands. In fact, I'm embarrassed to admit I'm a little like that mom. I gripe and complain all the time. Trust me, we know about that. Maybe my negative attitude has discouraged other people, or I've let petty grudges consume time and energy that they just don't deserve, or I've let someone else's negative words push me into the bleacher, and I've been discouraged by all of that. You want to add something positive to this church family? Here we are on the threshold of a new year. Why don't you say to everybody, 2020 is going to be different for me, and I want you all to know it. And I want you to help me, because we will. Or if you never made the decision to be a follower of Jesus, we'd like you to join our team and help us with this great cause in the year to come. And it begins with your decision to serve him. Either way, if you need to respond, you make your way to the front right now while we stand, while we sing.